student housing market in the UK has evolved really since the early 1990s. At that time, you only really had purpose-built student accommodation owned by the universities, and then you had the shared houses, like the young ones on the television programme. The idea of student housing as a purpose-built property sector was almost non-existent. I got involved in about 1992, 93, in the very early days of private sector players coming along and building purpose-built student accommodation. And at that time, there was really no transactional evidence at all. Virtually every block that was built was retained by the people who'd built it, who then built up an operational capability. They became developer operators. And for really until about 2005, there were no transactions. So I spent 10 years trying to value student accommodation, really on just relative to other sectors without any real evidence. And in a way, that's where we are now on mainland Europe. There's very little in the way of transactional evidence. It's very early days in the student housing sector in Europe, very much like the UK was in the early 1990s. But there is tremendous demand. There's a huge mismatch between demand for quality accommodation and the supply of accommodation. So we're seeing some developers coming into the market, looking at the opportunity in Europe, wanting to build critical mass so that they can attract investors who are themselves not really prepared to go for small one-off developments. They really want to buy thousands of beds, not just 100-bed schemes. So it's early days, but I think in Europe we are going to see an accelerated growth in the market following on from the experience in the UK and the US. And indeed in other parts of the world as well. In Australia, for example, it's very early days in their student housing market, but we're seeing that market really take off now. Lots of transactions, and we're working on projects in Sydney, for example, very substantial student housing transactions that are really showing what is now a new global asset class in a sector that is one of these alternative sectors that are very attractive to investors.